Hello, dear friends and colleagues. I'm very pleased to introduce this webinar on crisis communication. First, crisis is the essence of our business because we are here when client needs and when they need us more than when they are in crisis. So crisis is, as we always say, an opportunity, much for us sometimes than for the client, but it's always the possibility to demonstrate our capability to understand the issue for the client and to manage communication, but also sometimes legal issue, business issue, reputation issue together, because communication at the stand, it's not just for communication, it's to help the client to succeed. It was absolutely key in this world where communication and crisis are almost the same world. I mean, we are in the perma-crisis moment, geopolitical, climate, business, everything go more and more fast and go more and more to crisis. So to mobilize, I would say, all the H advisor network to do this work, to be better engaged in a common way and in exchange, in knowledge management, is absolutely, for me, a key issue. And I thank everybody to be there. And I wanted to thank particularly Shih-Huei, Vikki, Ricardo, and Roxane to have been so decisive in this meeting. So let's use crisis to show our ability to be the key strategic advisor for our clients. And let's assume that crisis is for us something that in fact we use to show who we are, H advisor. Thank you.
Hello everyone. H Advisors Havas Paris is delighted to organize a panel discussion. It will be the opportunity to address the nature of modern crises and the way of handling them for clients, prospects, and internal stakeholders. To start the discussion, it would be really interesting if you can explain what your definition of a crisis is. Vikki, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Roxane. I think for any client, a situation where they feel that they are at a loss or losing control of a scenario immediately feels like a crisis. I think we have a slightly different definition because we categorize them as incidents, issues, and crises. And I think crises at the very sort of top end of that scale of how a situation might progress is really marked by the fact that it might have the potential to be materially impacting a business. And by that, what I mean is it will have ongoing repercussions which can call into question the structure, the operations, or even the leadership of that business, as well as the ongoing and potential long-lasting reputational issues.
I would add to the definition that you so well gave us, that a crisis is also something that we must consider that for certain may happen someday and that we have to be prepared for. And it's very important that companies understand that a crisis can happen to anyone, to any kind of company.
I will summarize a crisis in 3 words. The first one being unprecedented. The second one being large scale. And the third, unpredictable.
What does it mean to prepare for a crisis?
It means everything. I guess the preparation is the root of crisis management. Without preparation, you have a huge problem if something may arise. And preparing a crisis may take many forms. Not being prepared for a crisis is like building a house of straw in an area where there are earthquakes, for instance. And my first question is always, does a crisis manual exist? If doesn't exist, it's urgent to prepare one. If it does exist, are simulations and drills carried out to test whether the company is prepared if something happens. Usually, I'm particularly insistent with my client on this point. And who are the company's spokespersons? How trained they are to communicate? Do they usually have media training programs? Do we know how to answer all the questions that we'll be have in the future? Q&A exercises.
Well, preparedness, as we say, is everything.
Yeah.
And I think when a client has that preparation, should the day happen, which we all hope doesn't, the company is much more controlled to be able to face the situation. I think the other aspect is the whole idea of what we call simulation. So trying to put a company through and the organization through a crisis in the form of an exercise. And that forces the team to use what Ricardo mentioned in terms of the planning, what we call a playbook, the manual, put it into practice, because nothing is worse than having a perfect manual that sits on the shelf or sits in the server that nobody is really quite familiar with. What we try to do is when a company has prepared and finalized its playbook or manual, we actually do insist that they have the familiarization exercise, means everybody involved. And this doesn't just involve the communication teams. This is everyone from the operations, communications, and most importantly, management, go through what we describe as a familiarization exercise, so they understand the process. And then one step further, they go through what we describe as a simulation. And we often are the facilitators of such a simulation assignment. It will involve companies going into a sandbox where they will have a platform or a protected email to be able to perform the entire crisis in what we call a safe setting, but certainly allows them to live out and feel a lot more comfortable. We think that makes all the difference. The other aspect is when we talk about the simulation exercise, it is something that, at least in Singapore, most public sector companies do this twice a year, minimally once a year. We would think that private companies and listed entities should take a leaf out of the government sector and do likewise. In other words, you should be looking constantly at your playbook and allowing your organization to go through these simulation exercises on a fairly regular basis, minimally on an annual basis. And that's something I would really emphasize around the preparedness of a crisis.
And you, Vikki, how to prepare for a crisis?
No, I think Shih-Huei and Ricardo have given, I guess, the dream scenario of where you have a client who you have access to in advance, where you have the influence to say, put in a manual, do your drills, understand who your working groups are. I think the reality is that so often we have clients that come to us where they haven't done that, or they have the perspective where they think that, when a crisis happens, the manual goes out the window anyway. What's the point? And look, I think our strong opinion, as Shih-Huei and Ricardo have already outlined, is that there is a huge argument to putting all of this background work in place. And the reality is that in doing so, what happens when you do face a crisis is that you don't lose precious time on those sort of the basics of gathering the right people, putting your operations in place, and allows you to tackle the issue at hand with a fair understanding of what it is from the outset. But in the scenario where you are that organization, where you're slightly more fly by the seat of your pants, I think as a bare minimum, what we would suggest that organizations have is have on board the people that you think will be there to support you if something were to happen. And that can, that's not just us as, your communications advisors, but also legal counsel, because so often that is an important part of what we're dealing with. if it's, cyber related, whoever runs your IT, so forth, have that planned out. Make sure that you have your selection of key advisors in role and that they understand your organization, how it operates, and potentially the sensitivities that it faces from the outset. Have those working groups. There's nothing worse than facing an issue and all of a sudden somebody says, I don't know how to get hold of X. And that is crippling, I think, to the progress of tackling any crisis. Be considerate of the elements that may trip you up. Even if you're not prepared to go down the route of scenario planning, at least have an understanding of where things broadly may be sensitive, but also things like time zones. I mean, it's extraordinary how often we speak to clients where they haven't factored in that, one of their operations is, say, in Singapore, and the rest of their operations are in London, and the two never cross paths. And so if something were to happen in Singapore, how do you notify people in London, and how do you make sure that everybody's ready to take that on board from the outset? And then I think the sort of, again, in terms of bare minimum, monitoring. What processes do you have in place to ensure that if something is bubbling up, you know about it before, it spreads too far? So making sure that from that side, both internally and externally, and obviously we can support on the external process, but the escalation process internally in terms of the monitoring is just as important. And don't wait until the journalist calls you up, please, because at that stage, it's probably too late.
We have had companies approach us and put us as their crisis team on record. I'm pleased to say that some of these mandates have not been mobilized for 3 years, and that's good for the client. Really good, because it means that they don't have a crisis. But it is literally that we've gone through the fair share of due diligence, we've gone through sort of the selection process. And as you know, in large companies, even the procurement process can take weeks and months. And I think no company wants to find themselves struggling to onboard their experts at a time when they need the response today and this hour. In fact, 2 days ago, we were activated on an international company crisis, and they were able to just move really quickly, but they had to sort of get the great exceptions from CEO because they didn't have the experts on record. But we were able to mobilize within minutes, and that's the kind of response they really needed for the crisis they were facing.
Do you think there is a discrepancy in how to manage a crisis between countries and regions?
I think certainly every geographic region has its unique peculiarities. I would say my observation, at least from Singapore and the Asia perspective, is classic of a lot of companies, is that idea where you hope to hide yourself under the covers and hope that the problem goes away. You have seen a number of big crises that have emerged where it has been uncovered that a company has taken 2 weeks, 3 weeks to be able to reveal that it was facing such an issue. Cyber crises, in other words, ransomware or what we call data exfiltration, are very common problems in Asia, and increasingly so as we enter such a digital world. It doesn't just happen to tech companies, it happens to all the best of us, including recently we were dealing with a legal firm on a data exfiltration. And that's really because a lot of our content and our whole business is moving online. And that security of it, sometimes with the best effort, does get breached. And this is where very unique in Singapore, where a company, when this happens to them, they think first, what are our legal obligations? How much can we keep away from the spotlight? Because it involves data, can we just hope it doesn't go into the dark web? If it's a ransomware, and let's just try and resolve it and negotiate, if we do choose to negotiate with the ransomware attackers, but let's not make it public. And I think that is a very common response of companies. I wouldn't blame the company who wants to be in the spotlight. But I don't think it's enough or sufficient to think only in the manner of, let's hope the problem goes away. When we talk about scenario planning, we always say, what is the worst that can happen? And we prepare our clients around the worst. The worst, therefore, is you are right smack in the spotlight. It is known that you are facing such a crisis. What is your response going to be? So I think this is something quite unique that many companies try to play. And I would counter that to say one has to look at the aspects around scenario planning, planning for the worst, and having that readiness involved. Why is that so important? I think the other aspect is around this matter of trust. If we don't get the situation under control, it is not so much the crisis in itself that's the problem. It's the lack of control or lack of ability for a company to take back that control. And that is so fundamental in resolving and handling a crisis, because if you don't show that the company is in control, I think very often the trust is broken and there will be a lot of pressure around senior management, even at the board level. And this is something that companies must take seriously, because if the trust is broken, even at the management and board level, I think the company is going into an unmitigated further exponential issue around their crisis. So I would say that is another aspect, trust, and the fact that one must take back control of the crisis, which will be very important. I think I'll leave with a final thought to the team before my colleagues also share. There's often this tension in a crisis when you have this, and again, maybe unique to Asia, but this sense of, I don't want to apologize. I shouldn't, because there are legal implications to apologizing, particularly if I don't know yet what my company liabilities are. And I think this has always been a bit of the tension between the comms experts and sometimes we call the legal experts. But as we come and have worked on multiple crises with our clients, we often assure our clients legal and comms sit on the same side of the fence, and that is in support to the client. There's always a way to be able to acknowledge empathy, apologize or show regret for inconvenience without the concern that legal teams have on this admission of the fault. So you may stop short at apologizing on the fault, but you should not stop short at showing regret or regret at the harm that it has caused or the inconvenience that it's caused, and definitely showing empathy. And that's what I would like to raise, because I think companies often forget that in the end, when a crisis hits, it hits at lives, it hits at livelihoods, and it deals with people. And if you can't show that emotional element around the crisis, you also will very often lose the control.
Yeah, this is the same in Europe, actually, Shih-Huei. There is a cost of not saying sorry.
It's curious, this example, because we had a situation recently in Portugal where a company, a huge company, had a data breach. And the response was precisely to be humble, to apologize, to admit the flaws.
Yeah.
And there's evidence right now that this way of dealing with the fact reinforced the confidence of consumers. It's one of the examples I have of a very good management of a situation. Transparency and honesty. These are two main pillars of any kind of strategy. Communication is increasingly global rather than regional, and I guess the Portuguese reality is no different than other countries, mainly in Europe, other countries in Europe, because of this. However, I may highlight one particularity or two particularities on Portugal. We have media facing huge difficulties, is experiencing gigantic financial difficulties. We have seen the death of many leading newspapers, and specialized journalists are disappearing, and they've been replaced by poorly paid, badly prepared journalists who are extremely permeable to disinformation campaigns. And I'm a little bit obsessed with disinformation, and that's this is where honesty and transparency and a good narrative works if prepared in advance. And this is a situation in Portugal. Media relations is crucial because of this, because journalists don't understand the problems. Usually, they don't understand the problems, and if a company doesn't have a good media relations partners, the problem is huge. The problem is very huge. Another particularity in Portugal, and this affects mainly crises where workforces are in place, such as redundancies or problems related to workers' rights. The unions, labor unions in Portugal are very, very strong and very direct to media. Labor unions and media have a very close contact. And in Portugal, a crisis that involves workforces, your primary stakeholder must be the labor unions, and you must go directly to them with dialogue and with your arguments. And this is mainly the two particularities I would highlight in Portugal.
I think a local knowledge of stakeholders is the key of success, and that's why it's good to have local support, but as part of a global network like H advisors to be stronger, but everywhere.
Both Shih-Huei and Ricardo have outlined things that feel very familiar from a perspective in London, just as much as I'm sure it is for you in Paris. But I think your point is actually a really important one. It's the fact that there are two elements in the development of any crisis that have really the impact, or have the opportunity to really impact how it then develops. And I think the first of that is the local zeitgeist. You know, what is the local narrative? What's the local cultural obsession that has such a sort of, you know, has a huge prism through which this crisis could be viewed. And I think in the UK, particularly at the moment, you know, elements of workplace behaviours and working practices, interpersonal relationships, that's a huge zeitgeist here. And it's a huge prism through which, certainly in 2023, we saw lots of companies fall foul to that, and that discussion of, you know, internal culture. And then I think the second element of the development of crises and how the importance of local presence can be felt is through the relationships. And that, I think, is both to the point that Ricardo made about understanding your local stakeholders. Who is it that really wields the power? You know, is it the local labor unions, or is it the local ministry, or, you know, whatever? And also, you know, from the other side, what's your best means of communication? So, you know, do you have a poorly staffed, under-resourced national newspaper syndicate, or is it the case that actually, you know, your best method of communicating in that country is through social media and going direct? And you know, I'm always amazed through our work with our Asian colleagues on the impact of platforms like WeChat, which just don't exist in Western Europe. And so I think fundamentally those two elements can have such a, you know, differing impact in how a crisis, which could be a global crisis, is viewed in different locations and how it plays out. And so for that reason, I think, you know, once we know that there is a local office in, say, Singapore or Hong Kong or wherever that will need that local insight. And so we're always quick to pick up the phone to our colleagues.
So thank you so much for taking part in this enriching discussion for Global Network.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you
you very
Roxane.
much.